Hey everyone! Today I'm going to be reading chapters 3 and 4 of Not a Drop to Drink. Okay, chapter 3. Hours later, Mother's voice jerked Lynn out of sleep. Remember what you asked earlier about what will we do if they come after dark? She gestured toward the south field. The idiots are bringing flashlights. They flattened themselves onto the shingles, cocked their rifles, and sighted toward the fan of lights coming for them. Mother counted slowly under her breath. I see 7, she said. I'm going to drop the one on the far left, supposing the others will break right when he falls. She raised the rifle to her shoulder. You might want to lead in that direction. Yes, Mother, Lynn said, raising her own gun. The crack of Mother's rifle made Lynn startle, even though she'd been expecting it. The lights immediately scattered, except for the farthest left, which fell to the ground and stayed there. Lynn's first shot went too far right in her excitement, causing the running men to scatter in all directions. Mother's rifle fired again, and another light fell to the ground, motionless. Irritated, Lynn fired again, this time dropping a light. Take a second to listen, Mother said. Lynn cocked her gun, ignoring the warm shell that rested against her arm. While they'd initially panicked and scattered, she couldn't hear any shouting or cries of alarm. The 4 remaining lights gathered together in a group, motionless, and stayed that way. What are they? Shh, Mother said. Listen. The lights didn't move, and the utter silence of the night overwhelmed Lynn. Even though it was cool, she swiped a bead of sweat that rolled down her nose. A stunned cricket tentatively renewed its song, to be answered by another a second later. Soon a chorus had begun. The lights still didn't move. Think they gave up? No, Mother said tightly. Be quiet. The lights remained still, but the crickets stopped. Here they come, Mother said confidently, cocking her weapon. Aim at what you hear. They dropped their lights. The rustling sounds of field grass followed moments later, and Lynn fired toward it. The scuffling stopped, but another sound followed, a low moan that could only mean she'd hit her target. More silence ensued. A male voice cut through the night, a sound so alien to Lynn that she cringed. Come on down now, girlies. We know you're up there, he shouted, his voice nearer than expected. And now I know where you are, you stupid son of a... Mother used a word Lynn had never heard before, and fired her weapon once. The sound of a body slumping to the ground followed. Minutes passed, with nothing but the continuous low groan of the man Lynn had wounded. What's that word you said? Lynn asked, curiosity getting the best of her. Never mind that now. A cricket chirped, and the wounded man cried out again, silencing it. Lynn thought she heard movement farther out from the house, and Mother's taut body reflected that she'd heard it too. It faded, and they sat tensely together for nearly an hour, hearing nothing but the occasional complaint from the wounded man. I think they're gone, Lynn said. Yeah, Mother agreed, her eyes still scanning the darkness futilely. We'll stay up on the roof, go down in the morning, get those flashlights. They'll come in handy. Another low moan rose from the grass. That was a good shot, Mother said, nodding toward it. Not good enough. Mother shrugged. It was dark. She rose and stretched out her stiff body, a sign that she truly felt safe. You'll get better. Another cry. Mother licked her finger, tested the wind, and fired once into the night. Silence fell. The morning sun revealed 5 bodies. Lynn spotted the one she had clipped. He had been standing on the west bank of the pond. The man Mother had spoken to was startlingly close to the house. The thought of him picking his way up the antenna while they sat together facing south gave Lynn goosebumps. She wrapped her arms around herself and rubbed them for warmth. Mother rose from where she'd been sleeping during Lynn's final shift, unmoved by the sight of the carnage. They didn't take the bodies, Lynn said, not even the ones farthest out. She nodded in the direction of 3 who had dropped while still holding their flashlights, nearly 100 yards from the house. Mother made an unpleasant noise in the back of her throat. The type of men who gather up 7 of themselves to attack 2 women in the middle of the night generally won't go back for dead friends. She scanned the horizon with her naked eye, nerves still on edge. Anything? Nothing, Lynn shook her head. Think they'll be back? Depends. They descended together, rifles in hand. Mother took a few moments to look over the body of the first man they came upon, the one she had spoken to. Seems well fed enough, she commented after struggling to turn him over. She stripped him of his gun and ammo, leaning them against the side of the house to collect later. Together they dragged his body out to the field for the coyotes. The other bodies revealed nothing else. None of the men had been in any danger of starving to death. Lynn and Mother relieved the bodies of their weapons, and they were lucky enough to find a pack of matches in the pocket of the man lying near the pond. Lynn noticed that her shot had taken him in the kneecap, and she winced at the thought. Mother's tidy, round hole in the middle of his chest had ended it soon enough. He was not a large man, and Lynn looked at him longer than she had the others, trying to figure out what made him seem different. "I'd say he's not much older than you," Mother said when she noticed. "Really?" Lynn peered closer at his face. "How can you tell?" "Well," Mother peered up at the gray sky as she considered how to answer. I guess it's in the way his skin isn't so tough. He's still got the little bit of baby soft on him." Lynn leaned forward, trying to see what Mother meant. "Also, he doesn't have much in the way of whiskers." Mother touched her own face to illustrate. "Kinda built small, too. You ought to put your foot up next to his, see if you think his boots would fit." Even the appearance of the other men had screamed enemy to Lynn. But this one, with his small eyes and hands that were clear even in death, wormed at her. "No," she said, "I don't think I will." Mother watched her cautiously. "It's probably time for me to." A flash of light along the corner of the woods to the southwest brought both of them flat on their bellies, rifles to the ready. Through her scope, Lynn saw Stebbs, his own rifle at his shoulder, peering in their direction. To her surprise, Mother stood up and hailed him with one arm. "Yeah, we're all right," she said under her breath. "Asshole." Mother looked down to where Lynn still lay prone on the grass, her rifle barrel resting on the torso of the dead body. "You don't have to help me with this one if you don't want to." "I'm fine," Lynn said, proving it by grabbing him under the arms and dragging him away before Mother could move to help. When she came back from the field, his boots were knotted together, dangling from his neck. They were nicer than her own, newer, with steel toes. The guns and ammo from the men went into the old steamer truck that Mother had tucked away beside the root cellar. Years of dropping anyone who came close to the house had given them a ready supply of weapons and ammo, but both women stuck to the rifles they had learned on, the stocks worn smooth from years of resting their cheeks against them. Lynn glanced at the shelves of the root cellar while Mother packed away the guns. The dim light that filtered in didn't show her anything reassuring. The glass jars from last year's canning were almost gone. The few carrots and celery Lynn had pulled from the ground earlier in the harvest were covered in sawdust, their green tops wilted. "We need to get out to the garden," Lynn said. "The second planting is out there waiting." "I know it," Mother muttered into the gun trunk, "but I don't like being so far from the house with those men from the south about." "I don't like the idea of starving." Mother's answer was to give her a handgun. "I'll come with you. We work fast and get back to the house. You should be purifying today, too." Lynn stuck the handgun into her belt. "I can't take a day sitting next to the tin when we should be harvesting. For all you know, it's wasted time anyway. The water could be just fine. That's how people in Africa cleaned their water, back when we still knew what people on other continents were up to." "Hell of a lot hotter in Africa," Lynn argued. "Their water probably just about boiled on sheets of tin." Mother snapped the lid of the gun trunk shut. "You ever had cholera?" "No." "Then it must be working," Mother said. "Either that or the water's always been fine," Lynn said, hating the idea of useless hours spent watching over bottles of water that didn't need purifying. "Only one way to find out, and if you're wrong, we're both dead. Now let's get out to the garden before I change my mind about that." Mother's mouth stayed down in its normal position, not inviting conversation as she stripped husks off sweet corn. Lynn was shelling the last peas while debating the pros and cons of breaking the silence. Though they spent most of their days working side by side, they hardly spoke to each other if they weren't on the roof. Voices could attract people or cover the sound of someone approaching. Mother kept her rifle within reach, the safety off. Only the right words could be used to break the silence. "We had 4 cords of wood this time last year." Mother stopped shucking, her hands still for once. There was a small grunting noise that Lynn took for agreement. "We've got 2, Lynn ventured. "It's not enough." "No," Mother agreed. "It's not." Her hands kept working, building up their store even in the face of futility. So why bother? Lynn's voice shook as she tossed the last pea pod into the bucket. Why gather water? Why pick the vegetables? Mother smiled thinly, hands still working. If I'd thought like that 16 years ago, I'd have drowned you the second you were born, then shot myself. But you didn't. Mother snapped another ear of corn from the stalk. Plenty did. I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Familiar with that glance Mother gave her, Lynn asked the question, Who wrote that one? Robert Frost. Lynn tossed another handful of peas into her bucket, where they barely covered the bottom. Why do you always quote poetry at me when all I want is a straight answer? Because I need to use my English degree, Mother said, then cracked a smile when Lynn's brow furrowed in frustration. Yes, I've thought about quitting once or twice. Then I remembered how they looked when they died. Others who quit. It's not an easy death. I've seen people die. Not slow, you haven't. Not people who know they're dying and they've got the worst of it ahead of them still. Mother kept working, her calm hands unfazed by the images in her mind. No, I've never really considered quitting. Not after seeing them. Lynn began plucking tomatoes off the vines, the spicy scent of the broken plants making her belly rumble. She talked over it quickly so that Mother wouldn't notice. So what are we going to do? Tomorrow I'm going to start turning the outbuilding into a smokehouse. Shouldn't be too hard. I'll pull up some flooring and put stones for a fire pit between the joists. Cut a hole from the roof for ventilation. It won't be airtight around the door, but it's better than nothing. Like I said before, I can kill a deer sooner if we smoke the meat instead of freezing it. You'll do the canning over an outside fire, and we'll keep a lookout while we work. With luck, we'll have everything we need for the winter squirreled away sooner rather than later, then spend most of our time on the roof and wait for them to try again for us. Meanwhile, we hope they starve or freeze to death. And what about us? What's to stop us from freezing to death if we don't have enough wood for the winter? There's always ways to get warm, Lynn. We've got blankets, our own body heat. We can go back to sharing a cot like we did when you were a kid if we have to. Or you can let me take the truck and go cut wood on my own. Mother shucked the last piece of corn, her mouth back down in its usual position. I could, she said, but I'd worry the whole time you were gone. You haven't been running a chainsaw that long, and you can't cut wood and hold a gun at the same time. The noise would bring people to you like bees to honey. What if I took the axe and looked for smaller trees? Smaller trees mean smaller pieces of wood. Smaller pieces burn better than nothing, Lynn shot back. Mother didn't answer. Instead, she looked at the pile of tomatoes beside Lynn and the heap of potatoes between the two of them. It's not a bad harvest. You get all the root crop down into the cellar and the canning done here before the days are out, and I'll let you take the truck and axe tomorrow. Okay, Chapter 4. It was a bittersweet victory, Lynn had to admit, by her 6th trip out to the garden and back to the root cellar. She raised the woolen blanket they kept dropped over the entrance to their pantry, sidestepping past the huge plastic drum that kept their purified water supply. Even though her arms were shaking, she was careful not to drop the buckets loaded with potatoes for fear of freezing them. They went into a pile beside the crooked shelves made out of stacked cement blocks and mismatched links of wood. Canning was a hot job whether done indoors or out, but Lynn didn't complain since Mother had taken the water gathering duties for the day in return. She dragged the cast iron pot up the basement stairs with the last of her energy and started a fire with one of the mashes taken from the dead man. The tomatoes came to a red boil as Lynn started a second, smaller fire to sterilize the glass jars. Work calmed her fears as usual. The feeling of doing something always overcame the fear of nothing. There would be vegetables for the winter, and if Mother would let her have her way, plenty of wood as well. The purified water still had to be moved down to the basement tank, but they weren't lacking. Soon the days would be short, and the breezes would bite. Lynn had never minded the cold. Winter meant diving back into the much coveted books that lay untouched on the shelf the rest of the year. Mother had used the encyclopedias to teach her something of the world beyond their small borders, but Lynn had no interest in what surrounded them. Not after seeing the globe. Mother had rummaged in the attic for it when she was making an argument for heading south. hoping that an illustration might sway Lynn. The vast expanse of blue that had covered it fascinated Lynn, and she'd asked Mother why they didn't seek out this unending expanse of water called ocean. Mother had knelt down to her height and held her face in her hands. I know it's hard to understand, but that water would make you sick. Lynn remembered arguing, her childish hope refusing to admit that so much blue could be a bad thing. There's a famous line from a poem about the ocean, Mother had finally said to end the discussion. Water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. Lynn had broken the globe afterwards, smashing its false promises to bits on the chopping block with her hatchet. The tears that had fallen while she worked were as salty as the ocean, but she had sucked them greedily off her lips. The canning was done by the evening, and Mother had emerged from converting the outbuilding into a smokehouse to help her carry the hot glass jars into the pantry. They had fresh corn over the fire, and the kernels burst juicily in Lynn's mouth as she crunched down on them, relishing even the feel of the bits that stuck in her teeth. Last night, Lynn tried on the steel-toed boots. They fit well, and she giggled when Mother dropped the biggest encyclopedia on her foot to illustrate what a good choice it had been to go ahead and take them. She tried not to let on how much it had bothered her to feel the outlines of the dead boy's feet inside the shoes. You chop your hand off and the shock will kill you before you can make it back to the house. Yes, Mother. Lynn hefted the axe back into the truck. Mother glanced nervously at the steering wheel as Lynn climbed into the cab. Stay inside of the house. I will. I'll keep my eye on you as much as possible, Mother said, slinging her rifle over her shoulder, but I can't always be watching. That finally caught Lynn's attention. Smoke to the south? Again, yes, Mother answered, shifting her eyes in that direction as she spoke, nervously scanning the skyline for any hint of other people. This morning while you slept. What did you make of it? Don't know. You have a handgun too? Lynn nodded. Just remember to squeeze the trigger, don't pull it. And go to the west, not south. Stay in sight, I know. Mother, it'll be okay. Right. Mother gave Lynn a long look before she stepped away from the truck. Okay then, go. Mother had taught Lynn to drive as soon as her feet could reach the pedals, but it had been years since she'd been behind a wheel. Gravel sprayed when she tapped on the gas, and Lynn tried to assure Mother with a smile and a wave as she pulled away. Even from the road she could see the concern stamped on Mother's features, but there was no help for it. They needed heat. They needed wood. Lynn surveyed the countryside as she drove, making sure to keep the house in the rear-view mirror while dodging the huge potholes that pockmarked the road. She spotted 2 or 3 downed trees that looked as if they'd fallen years ago. A strong wind a week earlier had knocked most of the grass down so that Lynn could see woods in the back acres of the fields, untilled even during Mother's time. The ride back to the woods was bumpy, the shocks on the truck having given out long ago. Lynn smacked her head on the ceiling of the cab, but it was exhilarating. The smell of the crushed grass under her tires, the 2 tracks following her in the rearview mirror, even the panicked grasshoppers that accidentally jumped through the window were a cause for amusement, a break from the norm. She parked parallel with the woods, putting the truck bed near a huge cracked trunk of a maple. Lynn got out of the cab and looked toward home, barely visible on the horizon. She waved, not knowing if Mother was watching her at that moment or not, but it felt better to pretend she was. She grabbed the axe and headed toward the tree. She recognized the warning shot for what it was the second it sliced through the mud at her feet. Lynn instantly froze and put her arms into the air as far as the weight of the axe allowed. The crack of the shot faded away into the distance, but no one called out to her. Slowly she lowered her arms and studied the woods. The shooter was under cover there, and she was in no position to return fire. There was a handgun tucked into her belt, but her hands were full and she was in the open. She was near enough to the fallen tree now to see cuts in the trunk and bright piles of fresh sawdust strewn around. Lynn turned her back toward the truck and walked slowly, very aware of what her back would look like in the crosshairs of a rifle. Whoever it was, they didn't mean her harm. The courtesy of a warning shot was more than most people extended these days, and the fact that she'd left the field with her truck said a lot. The thought of returning to Mother with nothing after having to beg to be allowed to leave in the first place made Lynn's cheeks burn brightly as she drove home. She slammed her palm against the steering wheel, borrowing the new phrase she learned from Mother this night the men of the South had come. The men from the South had come. Son of a bitch. Mother seemed more amused than anything once she saw that Lynn was perfectly fine, minus a bruised ego. Lynn stamped across the floor of the basement, her fuming anger more than sufficient to heat the room. At least it was someone nice enough to fire a warning shot, Mother said. Doesn't matter, Lynn snapped. That's the farthest out you're going to let me go. I won't be able to see the house much past that, and I didn't get anything else that was down and big enough to be worth cutting. Lynn went to the pantry for an apple, her anger not enough to quell her appetite. You hungry? Oh, pretty much always, Mother said, and Lynn brought her an apple as well. When she handed it to her, Mother grabbed her wrist. What's that? She pointed to a cut across the palm of Lynn's hand, bruised and red from a slight infection. Nothing, Lynn said. I got scraped the other day moving wood over for the canning fire and forgot to clean it out right away. Always clean it, Mother said stiffly. Always. You know what to look for? Red streaks for blood poisoning, growing up my elbow. And gangrene? Lynn snorted. I'm sure if I developed gangrene, you would notice the smell pretty quick. I don't know. I won't always be here to double check you, Mother said. Don't say things like that. To even hint at a future time when Mother wouldn't be around sent her heart soaring into her throat, a worried pulse of adrenaline shooting through her veins. How do you know what gangrene smells like anyway? Mother changed the subject. Lynn pulled the stem from her apple before answering. Because of Stebbs, she said quietly. Because of his leg. Mother looked down quickly and cleared her throat. I didn't know you remembered that. Kind of tough to forget. When Mother didn't offer anything else to the conversation, Lynn barreled on. How old was I? I'm guessing 7? 6, she was corrected. You were 6. But nothing further. It seemed young, Lynn thought, to have been sent to get the tomatoes from the garden alone, but at the time the coyotes had not been so numerous as they were now. The smell was distinctive. Even in her youth she had known that meant danger. She had stopped, sniffing the air like an unsure fawn in the spring. The hand had come as a shock, starkly white against the new green grass of the tramped path. White and flecked with freckles, something she looked at curiously for a moment. Neither she nor Mother, the only people in the world, for all she knew, had them. Hey there, little one. His voice had been thin and weak, but it had still set her back, and she tripped in alarm, landing on her bottom. It's all right, he said. I need help. Get Lauren. The last word had meant nothing to her. A foreign mixture of 2 syllables she'd never heard before. Your mother, he added patiently. Get your mother. That word she knew, and she had bolted home, a panicked message on her lips that Mother had deciphered after a few moments. Lynn remembered the shock that had passed over Mother's face. It was the first time she'd ever seen that Mother could feel fear. And then she had turned and run, leaving Lynn to follow as best she could. The strange man was propped on his good leg and leaning against Mother by the time she caught up. The sight of his metal trap, its straws embedded firmly into swollen, stinking flesh just above the man's ankle, had brought Lynn to a screaming halt. The 2 adults had shuffled awkwardly back to the house, Lynn carrying both their weapons and following behind. The man's foot had banged against the cinder-block wall of the cellar as they clumsily helped him down the stairs, and he'd howled so loudly that Lynn had run back to the landing, peering down into the basement as Mother eased him onto her own cot and looked critically at his ruined foot. Mother had ordered Lynn back downstairs, and she had been put to work ripping a rag into shreds for binding. Boiling water, and then up to the upstairs kitchen for their sharpest knife. After that, she'd been banished to the upstairs bedrooms, somewhere she had hardly been before. A thick coat of dust covered the room that Mother called Lynn's room, even though she'd spent most of her life on the roof or in the basement, where the only windows were inches above ground level and easy to defend. She'd sat on the dusty frame of her unused bed and tried not to listen to the screams coming up through the vents. The memory still had the power to chill her. The stranger had passed out under Mother's ministrations, and a shaken, pale version of her mother had come upstairs and sat next to her on the bed for a few moments before speaking. That man is called Stebbs, and he'll have to stay with us for a little while until he gets better, she had said calmly. It was the first and only time Lynn could remember speaking to anyone other than Mother. She had very little memory of him, only that she'd had a fascination with his stubble that seemed to amuse him, once he was healthy enough to be amused by anything. and when he was gone, someone she would only see for years afterwards through the lenses of binoculars or the crosshairs of a scope.